Hello, everybody. My name is Meredith Doig, and welcome to this monthly RSA webinar. I'm president of the Rationalist Society, for those of you who don't know me, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. We began operations in 1906. Now, before we begin the webinar, I would like to invite you all to join with us in acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land and sea and community. Tonight, two courageous women, two politicians who are prepared to stand up to the very powerful voices of religious conservatism in this country and urge their colleagues to recognise the increasing number of the non-religious in Australia, now nearly 40%, according to the last census, up from 30% a few years ago, to recognise them, plus people of various faiths in their communities, by changing the tradition of opening their meetings with a Christian prayer. Just to give you an idea of what we're up against, there's a council in Queensland, Redlands Council, who open their meetings with a devotional segment performed by a local priest or a pastor that can take up to 10 minutes of Christian worship. 10 minutes. I don't know how they put up with it, but anyway. So there is a very strong tradition and people who are prepared to stand up and try to defend that, and sometimes they're very aggressive in doing so. But thanks to the two people that we have with us tonight and others like them, there is really now a growing momentum for change across Australia. The new president of the Federal Senate, Sue Lines, she said in her very first week in her new job that she really didn't want to read the prayer, the Lord's Prayer in the Senate, but she has to because it's part of her job. Independent Senator David Pocock said that he'd prefer to replace the prayer with something which is much more inclusive. Down here in Victoria, the Labor government has said that they would address the issue if they are re-elected in the elections coming up in November. And there are more and more councils across the country who are making the change. And also there are over 6,500 people who've signed my petition on change.org about prayers in Parliament. So back to our two guest speakers. Jodi Reynolds is a councillor with the Mildura Rural City Council, who's tried to replace the Christian prayer ritual at her council with something which is much more inclusive, and we'll hear her story and how it's going in just a sec. Abigail Boyd is also with us. She's a member of the upper house in the New South Wales Parliament, and she's also tried to move, or she's moved a motion to replace prayers in that parliament with a brief period of silent reflection. So we'll also hear from Abigail. I also note that there's a few people with us who we might ask to say a few words. Let's see, no, I was hoping that Kay Gartner might be with us. She's from the city of Shoalhaven. She was a councillor there who tried to recite a Buddhist prayer, only to be very rudely interrupted by some Christian councillors and basically told to shut up. So I was hoping we could hear from her, but maybe at a later stage. But we also have with us Professor Luke Beck, who's a constitutional law expert from Monash University. Luke had published just recently an article in a peer-reviewed journal called Our Father Who Art in the Town Hall, in which he argued that the practice of reciting religious prayers as part of council proceedings is most probably unlawful, or is unlawful. So if we have time, I might call on Luke to just give a summary of the article that he wrote. But let's get going. And Jodi, if I could turn to you first. Now, I understand that that your council, the Mildura Rural City Council, currently opens with the mayor asking everybody to stand and to recite this prayer. And I quote, "Almighty God, we who are gathered together in council pledge ourselves to work in harmony for the welfare and development of our rural city. Guide us, we pray, in our deliberations. Help us to be fair in our judgment and wise in our actions, so that prosperity and happiness shall be the lot of our people. Amen." So Jodi, how's it going?
I'm getting triggered just by listening to it again. Thanks, Mary. Yes, so, I find, I feel very uncomfortable standing up and listening to those words. It's there for me. That's an hypocrisy for me to stand and to devote myself to God before I make any of my deliberations. So I find it very uncomfortable. So I can imagine that somebody who comes from a different religion or a different background would find it really uncomfortable if they had to stand and dedicate themselves to those words before a council meeting. So what it represents to me, it's a barrier. It's a barrier to diversity in our council, and it's a barrier to people coming into our council and being able to represent their community, and I'd like to see it go.
And what are you hoping for in terms of the outcome of your lobbying?
So what I'd like to see is some sort of affirmation that all of the councillors can participate in and feel comfortable participating in. It has been suggested that if I don't like it, perhaps I can just sit down, which, to me, that's a discrimination right there. That's the separation right there. What we need to do is to make sure that there's something that all the councillors can join in, something that all the councillors can relate to. And that's what we're going to work towards over the next couple of months.
And how are the numbers going? Do you think you've got enough support?
I think I do. I think that there are some councillors that need a little bit more thinking about this. They probably need to go to the people that support them in the community and have discussions with them about this. Mm-hmm. But I've had people from both sides of the debate talk to me about it, and those that agree with me and with us as rationalists are just so grateful that somebody is putting their hand up to do this. So it does give me a little bit of impetus to keep going.
And so you've had emails, you've had people speaking to you in support?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. But having said that, I've also had emails that don't support it as well. There's absolutely two sides to this story. Yeah. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. And we know that there's been some media attention about this issue. There's a local federal member, Anne Webster, who apparently is a Pentecostal Christian and maybe affiliated with the Australian Christian Lobby. We're not quite sure.
I believe Anne was also the chair of the federal committee that was looking into religious discrimination as well. So, yes.
The Religious Discrimination Bill.
Correct. Yep.
Right. And so she came out on the media on Sky News to say she claimed that over 60% of people in Mildura are religious, and that the council was being woke in trying to change this. Did you get any sense about how people responded to her comments?
Look, Anne has made a bit of a habit of being sort of deliberately misinformed, and people know that. And they're smart enough to pick it out very quickly when it comes up. But that term, the woke term, it's become quite derogatory in this, in any way that the people would like to use it. But the fact is that the council that we have in Mildura now, we were very open when we were being elected as to what our platforms were, how we would go about making our decisions, and we were elected. So this area of actually about 46.9 people who say that they're not affiliated with any particular religion elected a progressive council, and we're just fulfilling that promise.
My understanding also, I know some people who live up that way, and my understanding that there are quite a number of minor people who follow minor faiths as well. Is that true?
Oh, I'd say so. We're a really diverse community up here. We've got people from, quite a few people from the Sudanese background. We've got a really healthy and thriving Afghanistani community here, which we're really proud of. And we would like to make sure that we, make this place as welcoming as possible for these people and they feel part of the community. And that means they have to take up leadership roles and feel that they're welcome in those leadership roles. So yeah, we have diversity here. Yes, we have people from minority backgrounds. And it's the job of a council as a service provider to make sure that we look beyond the majority to those minorities and make sure that our services are reaching all those people. And if we've got people from, predominantly white European backgrounds who don't really understand their inherent privilege, that does make it difficult to make sure that those services are reaching the people who need them.
And Jodi, do you have in mind what you would like to replace the prayer with?
Oh, there's some great examples out there, actually. There's some other councils who have got really beautiful affirmations. I'm not going to sort of preface any of them at the moment, but just to say there's some gorgeous ones out there, and actually we'll see if our community, we'll put them out there to our community as well, so that they can have a look at them too. Right.
And just lastly, why did you sort of take this issue up? Was it something that you've considered for a long time, or is it quite recent?
No, it's something that I've considered for a long time. And when I found myself in the position, of having to say that prayer myself, I realised that I couldn't not, try and do something about it.
So it felt inauthentic.
Absolutely.
Okay. And just finally, what's the next step in your journey?
So the next step, I think, is to work on that affirmation, to sort of socialise that with the community as well, and to make sure that we've got something that we're all comfortable with. And then when we do, I plan to bring that back to the council to see if we can get that prayer replaced with that affirmation. Fantastic.
Thanks, Jodi. Abigail, can I now turn to you? You've been pretty outspoken about your view that the tradition of prayers in Parliament is absurd. And in fact, you're all over the local papers.
Yeah, apparently.
I think there were, in my last count, there were 42 local papers that had that article from AAP where you were claiming that the tradition was absurd. Anyway, but also that it alienates the general community. So again, can I ask you what brought you to take this stand?
So I had never stepped foot in New South Wales Parliament before I was elected 4 years ago. And when I first sort of turned up for work, if we want to call it that, I noticed immediately. Yeah, I noticed immediately that my workplace was like no other I'd ever been in that the walls were covered with predominantly white men. So pictures of white men. We had there's busts of previous presidents who are white men throughout the chamber. There's a very colonial picture, depicting the white settlers basically threatening Aboriginal people on the wall. It's a very old-fashioned sort of a place, but what it was doing was really setting up that this is the norm. This is the type of politician we have here. When we look back through decades, this is who we have. And then so that was a bit of a shock. And then I quickly realised that another one of the norms was religion, and that the average person who had been a politician in that place was Christian, and that was reinforced by the norm of having a prayer first thing every day before we could take our place in the chamber. And I did. I found it absurd. And I found myself waiting outside while the prayer was read with the other sort of ungodly few, and then having to sort of scurry in to try and get in before the acknowledgement of country was read out. And when I mentioned this to my friends, they were gobsmacked that this practice occurred in, somewhere, a parliament that's supposed to represent us all. And so the Greens have had a long history of trying to get rid of the prayer as being this sort of norm that we start Parliament with. But I took it on as a personal issue because I felt so affronted that as a white woman, I could feel like I wasn't, really the norm in that place. But if you were, a person who was from a different religious background, or a person of color, or a person with disability, you had these extra levels of feeling like this was not the place for you.
Let alone a person who may have grown up with a religion, but who has consciously left that religion for various reasons.
That's right. It is actually triggering for some people. I had never, and people are surprised when I say this, but I had never heard the prayer set out properly. I didn't actually know what it sounded like. And I think, again, I keep coming back to that idea of it being absurd, because the language that's used in the prayer that's read out in Parliament is so archaic and I understand that for people of that faith, it means something very deep to them, and that's great. But to me, it doesn't have a meaning. It is a waste of my time. I have to stand outside and wait for it to be over. I would much prefer that we came together at the beginning of the day and we could all stand there and have a moment of silent reflection where you can, if you are a person who likes the prayer, you can recite that in your head. If you would rather reflect on your responsibilities, people of the state that elected you, you can do that. You could even just centre yourself for the political battles ahead that day. But that, I think, would be significant in much the same way without being exclusionary.
Right. So what is the process now because I think you have moved a motion, is that right?
Yeah.
What's the process from here as it moves through the Parliament? So
this was really just a cheeky reminder. So we had, I first moved this motion in 2019. I put it on the paper, October 2019, and immediately had the right-wing media calling me. And I was shocked. And I refused to talk to the media about it because it was not a matter for them. I thought it was a matter for the members of Parliament to decide whether or not they wanted the prayer. And I didn't want to make a media circus out of it. I left it for a year while people thought about it. And then I tried to move it on the floor of Parliament. And the reaction was so extreme. People were so upset that I had brought it into such a rush with them only having a year to consider. And so I let it go, out of respect for where people were at. And then I brought it back in the form of a congratulations for all of the amazing councils that have managed to do away with the prayer, and calling again for Parliament to consider whether it's something that we should have. So it's sitting on the paper, but I don't think we'll actually get to have it debated before Parliament.
And have you got a sense of how many of your colleagues might support the motion if it ever came to be voted upon?
It's a very good question, and I've tried to flush that out. But unfortunately, when I moved the motion last time, both the Labor and the coalition parties were very quick to shut down any independent thought on the matter.
Mm.
And they basically both came to the table saying this is not something that we will support, instead of giving any kind of conscience vote to their members. So it's unclear, but I would think we have close to half in favour of the prayer and half that aren't in favour. I think a great number of them aren't prepared to have the battle. But yeah, it's there are quite a lot of religious MPs.
You don't quite know what the numbers are at this stage.
No.
But it's interesting. I mean, New South Wales in the census was the most religious state of all. So
yes.
you've got your work cut out for you.
Yeah, I do think though that the parliament is still wildly disproportionate when you look at the number of very religious politicians we have from both Labor and Liberal compared to the population. And that worries me, because I don't believe that and it's one of the reasons why I feel very strongly about this, because there are so many politicians in New South Wales who want Christianity to be the norm in politics. And I think that's fundamentally anti-democratic.
And in education, by the way.
Yes, very much so.
So what people like you who do feel very strongly about this, your colleagues, Senator, Upper House councillors and the MPs, the MLAs, what do they do when the prayer is read?
We wait outside.
Oh, you do? You gather outside the door like naughty children?
Yes. Along with people of various other faiths. So it's and it's very tricky, and sometimes people are expected to be on the floor because the business moves really quickly, and sometimes people are expected to just be in there. And certainly once they get into a leadership position, I've noticed that people that used to not be very interested in the prayer have to sort of pretend to honour the tradition and be seen to be part of the prayer. But no, there is, I call them the godless few, and we stand outside. So yes, I've only been caught once in their unawares. I didn't know that they hadn't done the prayer yet, and I had to stand there during the prayer. But apart from that, it's I've avoided it.
Right. Do you get I mean, we certainly get a sense from down here in Victoria, where the Labor government has said that they will address this issue if they're re-elected in November. So, but I'm conscious that, we might have a bit of a disproportionate view of the rest of the country. But do you get a sense that in New South Wales that there is a bit of momentum on this issue?
I do, because more councils have been successful in getting an alternative through than they were after the previous council election. So I do think people are moving towards it. And universally, if you stay out of the right-wing media and the people who love to email me with their views on this, if you stay away from that, and I think you speak to the average person on the street, they either don't know that this is what happens on an average workday in Parliament, or they know about it and think it's really funny. And I like to say, I didn't have to do this when I was at Kmart. Before I started putting things through on the register, I didn't have to do it when I was an investment banker before the stock market opened. Like, this is not something that people do in their day-to-day lives when they're not actually religious themselves. I think the danger is that it often gets set up as this false debate between, I get told quite regularly by colleagues from other parties that I'm anti-religious, or that I don't, that I'm somehow anti-Christian. And I think that kind of view gets pushed by the right-wing media. But of course, it's not about that. It's about the norm that it sets in our parliaments and the way that excludes everyone else who's seen as other.
Yes. And, it's likely to get worse. I mean, the people who are defensive in that regard are likely to get more shrill over time, because their numbers are declining. And we know that actually, even amongst those who do identify as religious or say religious Christian, do identify as Christian, most of them are quite progressive in their views on matters such as access to abortion and voluntary assisted dying and equal marriage and so on. It's only a very small percentage, maybe 10% of those who say that they're religious who are the real zealots, but they're very zealous in their actions. So
yeah, and I guess just one final comment on that, because sometimes it can get a bit much when people are sort of yelling at you. But I make myself feel better by assuring myself that all the time that they are losing themselves over the fact that someone dare try and get rid of the prayer, they've got less time to be beating up on the queer community or other sort of vulnerable people that these,
so you're
these
taking
zealots
the
often
flak.
have a go at. So yeah, I feel like I'm sort of taking the flak for them. So that's that gives me comfort.
And look, for those of us, for people who are watching this, who live in New South Wales, and who agree with you, how can they support you?
I think by writing to their MP and explaining it to them quite rationally, that this is not about being anti-religion. This is about diversity, and that it benefits all of us to have a diverse parliament. So yeah, I think talking to other people, explaining the issue, and writing to your MP is really useful.
Yeah, it's about being properly representative of a diverse community, but it's also about the political principle of separation of church and state. The government ought not to interfere in matters of the church, but the church ought not to interfere in matters of the state.
That's absolutely right.
When you get that conflation, that's where you get the danger.
I think the only thing that's made the coalition, the very religious coalition members, angrier than me trying to get rid of the prayer, is when I gave a speech that was calling on the government to get their theocracy out of my democracy, and they were red with anger. So I think, but it was exactly on that point. So I agree.
Fantastic. Hey, thank you, Abigail. Now, look, I do note that Kay Gartner is with us, and Kay, I'm going to invite you. I'm going to make you a co-host. Kay Gartner is from the city of Shoalhaven, and she has a bit of a story to tell. Kay, are you with us?
I'm here, Meredith. Lovely to see you and be speaking with you again.
There you go.
Yeah, I'll just see if I can turn my camera on. Anyway,
Kay,
I'm sure I can.
What I was going to ask you was not maybe the whole sorry story, but it has a happy ending. So tell us about the happy ending.
Okay, so we did go to the local government election in 2021, December 2021, here in New South Wales, with a campaign slogan of 6+1, that we wanted a progressive majority. And not one of our campaign pledges, but one of our discussion topics was that we would remove the Christian-only prayer and replace it with a minute of silence. For all the reasons that Abigail and the former speaker have suggested, because, and so we won that council election. We got our mayor, Amanda Finley, our Greens mayor, and a progressive council behind her. And at the very first council meeting, one of the Labor councillors got up and moved that we replace the Christian prayer with a minute of silence. And that was accepted. It was adopted by the council. It wasn't unanimous, but we did have a majority. And that's been the practice ever since. So now the council begin with a minute of silence, and then actually I think still acknowledgement of country is still at the top of the agenda, then a minute of silence, and then the national anthem. So it's a definite step forward and has been much appreciated.
Well, I'm hoping that your happy story, after the quite shocking treatment that was handed out to you initially, but let's hope that there are more councils who see that this is not, it's a positive thing. It's a move forwards, not a move backwards. This is a move to bring Australia into the 21st century, where we do have almost, as the census says, half of us have at least one parent born overseas.
Mm-hmm.
We have 40% of people who consciously chose the no religion box on the census. So we know that the Australia of these days is very different from the Australia of 100 years ago when our parliaments first started. And
thank goodness.
Yes, indeed. But why should we not update our rituals so that they are representative, positively representative of the Australia that we are now, rather than the Australia that we were 150 years ago?
Absolutely. And of course, one of the greatest joys has been staff. Like, we have over 1,000 people working for the Shoalhaven City Council. And one of the greatest joys has been the people who are Buddhist staff. We have Thai people, we have Tibetan refugees in our community, and, numerous other cultures who are Buddhists, like myself. And so having them come up and be so pleased that they were acknowledged in those debates, painful as it was at the beginning, that finally it came out really well. And having people of no religion be free to stand and contemplate, and not, as Abigail is still having to do, stand there or avoid that time and listen to not only meaningless but really quite confronting things. As a feminist, the Lord's Prayer is confronting for me. As an ex-Catholic, it's confronting. As you were saying before, it's triggering for people. And a moment's silence leaves everybody free to use that minute as they see fit. So it's very democratic, it's very inclusive, and it creates space for all people to come into that chamber, for all people to know that they're welcome, and for no one to feel that they have to be, wish they weren't present for an item that's on the agenda. It's on the business agenda. It's not optional. So, we're really pleased with ourselves in the Shoalhaven, and I'm delighted to be being acknowledged both in Abigail's speaking and to be able to support other councils and councillors to go down the same path, and wish them all the best success with us. And of course, we all know that it's only a question of time, but sooner is better than later.
Yeah, terrific. And well done, you.
Yes,
Fantastic.
thank you.
Yeah,
and thank you
actually,
for all the support you offered, Meredith. The support of the Rationalist Society, SCI. I remember you ringing me when I was way out the back of nowhere one day, and I just thought, oh my God, people do understand, and this is an important issue. It's worth carrying on.
Yeah, and it goes to who we are as a nation, who we are as a culture, and our values and our principles.
Yeah.
You mentioned the having the prayer in the council proceedings, and that's a really good segue. I wonder if I might just ask Luke Beck, Professor Luke Beck, to very briefly summarise the paper, the research that he did on this matter, and the conclusion that he came to. Luke?
Thank you very much, Meredith. Happy to do that. And thank you to Abigail, Jodi and Kay for really interesting remarks. So I wrote a very short article in the Alternative Law Journal last year based on a case about 10 years ago in the English High Court, a case called National Secular Society against Bidford Council. And in the UK, in England, their council system is broadly similar to ours. Local councils are established by legislation. They're elected. They have a mayor, and councils can only have the powers that are given to them by legislation, which is exactly the story we have here all around Australia. And this council, Bidford Council, which is a really tiny town in southwest England, they had a practice of having opening prayers at all of their council meetings, which lots of Australian councils also do. The National Secular Society in the UK sued Bidford Council, saying, well, we don't like this, but this is actually unlawful because you are a council, you are a governmental entity, and you only have power to do those things that your governing legislation says you have power to do. And guess what, guys? Your governing legislation does not say you can have religious practices as part of your official meeting procedures. And the English High Court said, yes, that's actually true. Look at the legislation. There is nothing in the legislation that says the council can have an opening prayer or any religious observance as part of its official proceedings. And in fact, the legislation talks about democracy, councillor equality, councillor inclusion. So there's absolutely nothing in the legislation that lets you do this, but you're doing it. So therefore, what you're doing is unlawful. And so the practice was struck down by the English High Court. Unfortunately, the practice was reinstated after the British Parliament passed legislation to give the council express power to do it. But the moral of the story for councils right around Australia in all states is that the same logic that the English High Court applied in that case applies here. If you look at the local government acts in each of the Australian states that set up local councils and give them their powers, there's nothing in those statutes that give the councils power to have prayers or any other kind of religious practice as part of their official proceedings. And equally, just like in the UK situation, there are provisions in the local government acts that talk about councillor equality, councillor inclusion, full participation, multiculturalism even in some states here. And so therefore, the legal position would seem to be that as a matter of law, Australian councils in fact do not have the power to have religious observances or practices as part of their official proceedings. And those that do are in fact acting unlawfully. And so, it is open to a councillor who is on one of these councils that has a prayer to go off to the Supreme Court in their state and say, Your Honour, this council is doing something it doesn't have power to do. Please issue an order saying stop. And
is that something that realistically could happen?
Yeah, so that's realistically something that could happen because this is not just one of those sort of, I'm an academic and, I do academic things, but this is not just one of those academic theoretical arguments. This actually happened in the English High Court. This is not entirely hypothetical. The English legislation is effectively the same as the legislation in all of the Australian states. The legal system is broadly the same. The same legal arguments apply here. And as a matter of the way that the Australian legal system works, Australian courts often look to the English courts to understand how the law operates, and vice versa. English courts also look to Australian courts too these days. So it's not purely hypothetical. There is a precedent for this, that English High Court case. So it's absolutely a viable argument for a councillor to go to court and say, my council is acting unlawfully by having an official prayer.
Well, if any councillor is in the audience, do get in touch. When we package up the video of this webinar, perhaps we'll give a link to your article, Luke, so that people could inform themselves of the argument there. Yeah,
absolutely. And there are cases in other countries too. There's a case in the Canadian Supreme Court brought by the Quebec Secular Society against a council called Saguenay, I think is how you pronounce it. It's one of those French words, so I've probably completely mispronounced it. And a similar story there, the council had an official prayer, and the Supreme Court of Canada, the highest court in Canada, heard this case, said, well, actually, no, that's unlawful. So there are legal precedents dealing with these things in similar common law.
Australian courts would also pay attention to the results of Canadian courts?
Yeah, so because England, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc., are all common law countries and have similar legal systems. So cases from all of those countries are persuasive and relevant precedents in all those other countries as well.
Okay, interesting. Look, there have been a couple of questions that members have sent in before. We always invite people to make comments or send in questions when they register for these webinars. So I want to read out, there's one from Tony Crins and there's one from Joanna Brown, and then we'll just see if there's any other questions in the chat box that we should go through. But if I can turn to Tony's, well, it's partially a comment, but also a suggestion. Tony Crins says, all government meetings should begin with a secular affirmation or a reminder, and it would be democratic to have a contest with public entries for a useful affirmation and choosing perhaps a dozen or so that each governing body could choose from. Jodi, what do you think about that idea?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question and the comment, Tony. that's something that the council did sort of consider at the end of the last council meeting. But when you're thinking about putting things out to public consultation, that can be a very time-consuming and expensive process. So what we're probably going to do is work amongst the affirmations ourselves as councillors. We'll probably come up with a couple, put them out there for people to have a look at and see which one they like best.
Mm-hmm.
But so yes, there will be some sort of public view of what we're doing. But as far as a full consultation process goes, we probably wouldn't head down that track, I don't think.
Okay. What about you, Abigail? What do you think the New South Wales Parliament might do something like that?
I just love the idea of it, and forgive me if I've misunderstood, but my kind of idea from that question, or the vision that I had, was very much a process where people might be invited to think about what they expect from politicians and what they expect that a politician should be thinking about before they go about their business. And I think, given the lack of interest in democracy that we're seeing, and the kind of reduced understanding of civics, I think just the very process of consulting on something like that and asking people to consider that would be useful for all of us. So
particularly at this time when I think people are much more conscious of integrity in their politicians, or wanting to have more integrity from their politicians. And an affirmation that maybe doesn't use the word integrity, but has that message to it.
Like even something very simple, you know, I will put the interests of the people ahead of my own, you know, something like that would be useful.
Well, I mean, coming from a person who sat on a number of boards and committees, all directors have a duty to put the interests of the company or the organisation ahead of their own interest. I mean, that's fundamental to a director's duty. So I don't see why it shouldn't be fundamental to a representative's duty.
You'd think so.
And they just need to be reminded of it every now and then.
Clearly.
Now, Joanna Brown has a question. She says, if a particular branch of government is not willing to delete prayer rituals for practices that are more secular, do you think it would be acceptable or even possible to invite a member of the public to give a prayer, regardless of the faith or lack thereof? Jodi, what do you think of that idea?
Yeah, that's been discussed amongst councillors as well. So that's been something that we have talked about. And I think for me, our council meetings can go for 2.5 hours or 3 hours at a time. So that, you know, anything that adds time to our council meetings, we probably would be trying to reduce. But also, once again, it comes back to what we were talking about with that separation of church and democracy, and that secular sort of issue. For me, I just don't feel that those sort of religious prayers and those religious things belong in a workplace at all, let alone a government workplace. So I wouldn't be promoting something like that, but if it was a step towards something different to that Christian, promoting those Christian values in the community all the time above all others, and then I would probably be
minimally acceptable.
Minimally acceptable.
Okay. And Abigail, what about you?
Yeah, I think Jodi's answered that question beautifully. I agree. I think there is absolutely a time and a place for educating everybody about the multitude of faiths and cultural practices that are practiced in our communities. But I don't think the place is, you know, in a parliament or in a council. And I think, you know, the reason that we apparently, you know, have the prayer is because it sits outside of the rest of society, and that we have apparently agreed it as a collective of members, and then it's gone into our standing rules. But I think we forget that there are all the other people in this workplace who don't have a choice in the matter at all, and have to either sit as clerks and attendants in the chamber itself, or be watching as, you know, one of the hundreds of staff members who are obliged to watch. So I just don't think religion has a place in this part of our democracy. And yeah, I agree with Jodi.
Hey, I note that you've got your hand up. You have a comment?
Yeah, I do, because it's this was what was happening in the Shoalhaven. People were invited to come in, and during COVID, the councillors were invited to give that prayer, and that is when, because my prayer wasn't Christian, I was attacked in the meeting. So I think there's a risk with that. Yeah, I really think that, I don't think that risk would go away just because you didn't have to do a Christian prayer anymore. And so I would really strongly argue against that system, and support Jodi and Abigail's view that there's no place for religion in our civic space. It's a workplace. We're there to do work, and with a minute's silence, anyone can have whatever prayer they'd like, but they're not going to, you know, infringe upon anybody else. And in fact, they're not going to be distracted either from the business at hand.
And it is a fundamental of the political principle of secularism, which is separation between the sphere of religion and the sphere of the state, which is not to say that religious people can't argue their case in the public domain. Of course they can, but it's not allowing the imposition of religion and religious tradition into the traditions of the state.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm just going to say that the reason we have the acknowledgement of countries, because that is a governance procedure that's been handed down through the generations. It's part of our First Nations governance tradition, that you're welcome here, respect our rules, we're going to discuss things, and, you know, you'll leave when it's the right time. So that is a governance procedure, and so it sits well in our council meeting. But prayer is not a governance procedure, never has been. Yeah.
One of our attendees, David Cohen, has a suggestion for an affirmation, and it's quite short. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read this, and I'm sure he can send it to anybody who is interested. His suggestion is this: let us come together in this place of welcome. Let us be grateful, especially for our community and our environment on which we depend. Laying aside all personal interests, and with wisdom, justice, mercy, and humility, may we apply ourselves to the true welfare of the people of this place. Quite nice.
I like it.
Shorter than the Lord's Prayer.
I think most things are shorter than the Lord's Prayer. Yes, I think that some people have argued that a moment of silence wouldn't give the same solemnity to the situation that you get from the Lord's Prayer. This sort of wording perhaps gives that tone to proceedings. I still would prefer a moment of silence, but if we had to have something, that's far better.
That's a really interesting argument, because I would say, you know, on the 11th of November, Remembrance Day, when you think about soldiers who have died for your country, and you have a minute's silence, and I would say that that's incredibly solemn.
I agree, and we commonly stand in silence to commemorate various things, and it is a solemn moment. Yes. And I did point that out during debate on the motion, but people persist with that view.
Good. So, well, I agree with you. Look, one of the things that came up, we were hoping that this is the beginning of a building momentum for change, positive change, I would say. But do you think in your various jurisdictions that there might be, it's not just, you know, people like myself who's a rationalist and doesn't feel the need for a belief in a supernatural being. I don't like calling myself an atheist because that seems a bit negative, but I've never really felt the need for believing in some sort of supernatural being. Anyway, but it's not just the non-religious like me. There are also people who are religious, but they follow different faiths. Do you think, Jodi, Kay, Abigail, do you think that there are faith communities who might join with us in urging this change that is much more reflective of the diversity of belief systems in our community?
I hope that they do, but I think this goes back to the discussion that we're having earlier about how vehement and sometimes quite aggressive and nasty the discussion can become on social media and in newspapers and in the wider community. Anybody who does want to enter into this discussion has to have a pretty thick skin and has to be able to really have a well-defined argument and a really clear pathway that they're planning to take with this and why they want to take it.
I remember, and I'm sure, I think Abigail commented on this in her speech, that the Buddhist Society was very, very supportive of when we had this issue on Shoalhaven Council back in 2020 and then again in 2021. Really, really supportive, wrote letters, So I think that there is support in the community for those, especially in those faith groups, and there are many of them, that really embrace diversity, the multicultural, not multicultural, well, they might be they obviously are multicultural, but the multi-dimensional interfaith meetings, there are very committed people who are in those meetings and who are on that journey. And so those people, often it's not their first priority, but certainly, if I was to do that campaign on council again, I would absolutely be reaching out to those people and then finding that 10% that you were talking about earlier who are actually committed to their values, which are, love one another as I have loved you, or, all those other variations of that theme, and who don't see conflict between their faith and another, because they are in fact involved in multi-faith. I remember one of our ministers saying to me after one of these horrible debates that he in fact had a PhD in interfaith practice. So, and he says, I'm totally on your side. So I would encourage any councils who are thinking about moving this through their community to do indeed reach out to those interfaith gatherings. They will be there. They have, every community has them. Write to the Buddhist Council because they'll be on board as well, and look for that support, because those of us who value inclusivity, who value goodwill to our neighbours, we want everyone to feel included, and we want to learn from all those expressions of variety of faith, as well as those people who don't have faith, and we want to learn from them too.
I have another affirmation or pledge, and this was put in by Stella Thomas from South Australia. It was one of the South Australian, a council in South Australia that suggested this. And their affirmation was this: we, the civic leaders of this community, recognise the responsibility placed upon us by the residents of our council, of this council. We will endeavour to work together in the best of our abilities by respecting and listening to each other and to our community, being open to new ideas, speaking honestly and deciding wisely for the people that we serve. Nice. Nice one. It's pretty short and sweet. Seems to.
Can I add to that, Meredith?
Yes.
That was me that posted that. That was in my local council quite a few years ago, when a councillor here tried to propose a replacement for the prayer, and they did a big community what do you call it, feedback, and it was pretty much all falling in favour of something like this, but ultimately the councillors got to vote, and unfortunately most of them were quite strongly supporting the prayer, and they said, yeah, we're going to listen to everything, and then voted as they felt.
Oh dear.
Unfortunately.
Well, but I do think that, the times are changing, and, these people, sometimes it feels like They're fighting a bit of a rearguard battle, but the majority of people, I think, are moving towards a recognition, which is supported by the data coming from the census, that we are a very multicultural, diverse society. We just can't stick our heads in the sand and imagine that we're still like we were 150 years ago. It doesn't compute. So I think they're going to, they'll still fight very hard and sometimes very nastily, as Kay has experienced, unfortunately. But I think there is this growing momentum. And so I'm hoping that this, amongst many things, the activities that the Rationalist Society is taking and others, we keep pushing on this issue, not in a nasty way, not in a negative way, but to say, let's look forward, let's be properly reflective of and let's recognise the variety of groups and people without denigrating any of them, recognising all of them, but just making sure that no one is privileged above all others, that we should recognise them all fairly. So with that, I'll get off my soapbox, and it just remains, I think, for me to thank our wonderful guest speakers. Jodi Reynolds, thank you so much. Abigail Boyd, thank you so much. And Kay Gardner, thank you for being part of a very active part of our registrants here, and good for you for your success in your Shellhaven Council. And thank you, Luke Beck, for summarising the paper that if anybody wants to get hold of, we can provide a link to Luke's very useful paper. And thank you everybody for coming along, for the questions that you put and for the comments in the chat box. Hopefully I'll see many of you in a month's time. The fourth Wednesday on each month is when we have our RSA webinars. I'm not quite sure that we've settled what the topic will be, but just check the RSA website and you'll find out what the next topic will be. With that, I wish you good evening and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you, everybody.